Welcome to Block 21 of our Celebrating the States Block of the Month. This is our version of the Wyoming block or the Wyoming Valley block. For this block, you will need 3 fabrics, a light, a medium, and a dark. From the light fabric, you need to cut 4 rectangles that measure 2.5 inches by 4.5 inches. You also need 12 squares that measure 2.5 inches by 2.5 inches. From the light, you also need to cut 6 squares that measure 3 inches by 3 inches, and then 1 square that is 3.25 inches by 3.25 inches. From the medium fabric, you need to cut 4 rectangles that are 2.5 inches by 4.5 inches, and 8 squares that are 2.5 inches by 2.5 inches. From the dark fabric, you need to cut 6 squares that measure 3 inches by 3 inches. You also need to cut 2 squares that are 3.5 inches by 3.5 inches. You will bisect both of those squares once to get 4 triangles. Unless otherwise directed, please use 1/4 inch seam allowances throughout the block. We're going to start by piecing 2 of the dark triangles onto opposite sides of the light 3.25 inch square. You just need to center it as best you can. It doesn't have to be perfect because we'll be trimming the block later. For the first round, I'm just going to finger press these seams open. Continue to add triangles to make a square and a square block. After you add the last triangle, make sure you trim off the little excess triangles that hang off the edge. I pressed it flat first, then I flipped it over and pressed the seam open from the back side. The last step will be to trim this block to 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches. To help me line up the block correctly so that when I trim it, the center square isn't wonky, I use my 2.25 inch lines to follow across so that the points are landing on the 2.25 inch markings. I'll trim the first 2 sides, then I'll flip the block over, trim the other 2 sides, and again, those points should all be on a 2.25 inch line. Next, we're going to make some mirror image flying geese units. So that it will be the medium fabric with light points or the light fabric with medium points. With right sides together, place the medium squares on one end of the light rectangles. You're going to sew corner to corner to get your seam allowance. Now you can either draw a line to follow, or you can use diagonal seam tape and use the lines on the seam tape to know where to sew. We're going to do the same thing with the medium rectangles and the light squares. Now at this point, you can either trim the seam to a 1/4 inch seam allowance and press, or you can sew an extra line of stitching 1/2 inch away from the first line, cut in between the 2 stitching lines to get spare half square triangle units that you can use in another project. Once you have these cut apart, you're going to take it to the ironing board and press the seams on the flying geese units open. In my test run of the pattern for this block, I had pressed all the seams towards the corners, but then when I went to put the rows together, it got a little bit bulky. So on my second run through, I pressed the seams for the flying geese units open, and the block went together much better. Now it's time to do the other side. When you're putting the squares on and you're sewing, just make sure that you're making flying geese units and not parallelograms. Make sure you watch to the end of the video. I'll show you an alternate colorway to do this block, and I've got some very special pictures from a gal who stopped in to share her blocks with me at the store. While she was here, I mentioned that I was considering having a Celebrating the States retreat sometime in fall of 2025. It would give us a chance to finish our quilts together and see everyone else's blocks. Leave us a message in the comment section below if that is something you'd want to do. Sewing these extra triangles doesn't take up too much extra time, and I promise you someday I'll show you a fun way to use them. Press the seams open, and while you're here at the ironing board, make sure you press those extra half square triangles you made. Now it's time to piece the flying geese units together to form an arrow with the medium fabric. Once pressed, and you'll press this seam open also, these units should measure 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches. If you're enjoying our Celebrating the States blocks, we hope you'll remember to hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss any of the future states. For this part, you need all of the 3-inch squares. You're going to place the dark squares right sides together with the light squares, and then you can either draw a line corner to corner so that you have something to follow, or you can use your diagonal seam tape, and then we're going to be sewing on both sides of the center line. Once you've sewn on both sides of the center line, you're going to use the scissors and cut between them right on that line that you drew. You will end up with 12 half square triangle units. We are going to press these towards the dark fabric. Once we're all done pressing, we're going to go to the cutting mat and trim them all down to 2.5 inches by 2.5 inches. When I trim these half square triangle units down to their proper size, I like to use my block lock ruler. The channel on the back side of the block lock ruler locks onto that seam, and then it makes it really easy to know where to cut. We're going to combine these half square triangle units with the 4 squares of light fabric that are 2.5 inches by 2.5 inches. You'll have an hourglass kind of look in the center of the block, and then the one corner will be the dark fabric opposite the light square. Sew these in sets of 2, and then we'll press. For the top half of the block, you're going to press towards the light square. For the bottom half of the block, you will press towards the dark triangle that'll end up in the corner. If pressed correctly, when you go to sew these 2 units together, all of the seams will nest. Press towards the section with the light square. Once you get these pressed, it'll be time to lay out the block to make sure you've sewn everything correctly. If it doesn't look right at this point, now is the time to take it apart and make it right. The flying geese arrows should point towards the center unit. Also, the corner blocks should all point towards the center unit. Basically, you have 3 rows to sew together. The top and bottom row are actually the same, just mirroring each other, and then the center row. As you pick up the pieces, make sure you double check that you're sewing it correctly. When pressing the rows, you want to press towards the parts that have the medium fabric. Just 2 seams left to sew and the Wyoming block is done. I highly recommend pinning the rows together at this point. It keeps the corners from shifting as you sew, makes it a little bit easier to get the rows together. For the final pressing, I pressed away from the center row. I pressed it first from the front side, just to make sure I don't put any creases into any of the seams, and then I flipped it over to the back side just to make sure everything was flat. If it needs it, you can give it a little encouragement to lay flat with some spray starch. For my alternate color version, I swapped the medium and dark values in the quilt block, and I also put a different fabric in the center of the block, just to give it a little bit different look. Quilting friends, I'd like you to meet Pat. She stopped at the store during the All Iowa Shop Hop and brought her state blocks along to show me her progress. It was so fun to see the blocks. They were perfect. I love how she was clever enough to label each block with a paper sewn right onto the block that showed the name of the state and the year they were admitted into the Union. Well done, Pat. And she had them all tucked safely into the storage bin. What a great way to keep track of them. Make sure you hit the like button, leave us a comment, share with your quilting friends, and subscribe. Thanks for watching and happy quilting!